All right, for many of us, it's the coldest time of the year, and lure selection can be a little tough, but there are some tried and proven lures out there that work every year, and I'm going to go through at least mine that I feel are the most productive for me during the winter months, starting with the jigging spoon. Now, the jigging spoon, in case you haven't seen these before, it's kind of a slab of metal. Looks just like that, right? You got the hooks, and it's just, it's a real thin piece of metal. Not a whole lot to it. But what they do is when you throw it, it just kind of flutters and falls down in different angles, and it looks like a dying bait fish, which triggers bass into biting. You can throw these in deeper water. That's what they're designed for. So in like that 20 to 40 foot zone, you're looking for specific types of structure, such as humps, ridges, brush piles, rock piles, creek edges and channels, ledges, drop-offs, things like that. This is where the bass are going to set up shop and hang out throughout the winter time. The key to finding the really good ones is you want ones that are near spawning areas. So you can have a lot of that throughout your entire lake, but the ones that are closer to spawning flats are usually the ones where you're going to have higher concentrations of bass. And those bass hang out and wait for bait fish to come by instead of chasing bait fish. So they're more of an ambush type thing, or they're just going to suspend over the tops of this type of structure, and that's where the jigging spoon comes into play. You can just drop that bait right down on top of their heads, and you just pop it up and down. The way you jig them, why it's called jigging, is it's very simple. You let it get to the bottom, and you lift up and then let it flutter back down. You lift up and let it flutter back down. But there's some variables to that. For example, how fast and how hard you lift it up off the bottom. And when you let it flutter back down, you kind of guide it back down with your rod. So you can slow down the rate of fall. And how slow that rate of fall is another variable. And how long you wait between lifting up and down is another variable. And when you start to combine these different variables, you finally figure out what the bass want that day. And it's oftentimes different from what it was the weekend before. So pay close attention to that, play with that type of those variables. Couple things, color, all you really need is gold and silver. That's about it. I wouldn't deal with really any other colors except for maybe a perch pattern, especially if the forage in your lake is perch. When you're down that deep, a lot of the colors get washed out and they turn to neutral tones, kind of shades of gray. And so any other colors really don't make that much of a difference. But if it's a perch pattern on there, it's still shades of, you can see that even if it's gray or black and white, you can still see that pattern on it. So that's worthwhile getting. But otherwise a gold or a silver works just fine. One other quick tip about it, if you notice, when these baits come out of the box, they come like this, right? Well, the problem is there's no snap. You don't want to tie directly to that hole because that's a surefire way of cutting your line. See how thin that metal is? That's going to cut your line. So get yourself a little snap, right? That's what I've got on this, tied on here. Just put like, size number 2 snap on there, and that way you're not going to cut your line. And it actually allows the bait to float freely and flutter more. So you're giving it a little more action and looks a little more natural in the water. Just a quick tip. One other thing too is the treble hooks that come with them out of the package. Typically I replace those with Gamakatsu round bed treble hooks. They just hook up a little bit better. If you're getting hung up on the bottom a lot, shorten that up to a short shank round bend treble hook and you won't get hung up as much. Jigs are another favorite lure of mine to throw during the wintertime. Actually, they work year-round, but wintertime's no different. But how you fish them is a little bit different. For example, first of all, we're going after that deeper water that I just mentioned, those rock piles, those ridges. Typically, it's void of cover per se, unless you got some logs or something down there. But you can fish deeper weed lines, though. Jigs work pretty well along those. Jigs kind of represent crawdads. And contrary to what some people believe, crawdads don't hibernate during the wintertime. They do bury up in the mud when it gets really cold and stay warm that way. And they get a little bit dormant and a little bit inactive. But they still come out to feed and they still get active, especially if you get a little warming trend and they get a little more active and they come out and they feed a lot. So those are just a protein a protein snack. And if the bass can find them, man, they're going to eat them because that's packed with a lot of food, a lot of energy for them. So jigs can be very, very productive. This time of year when you're fishing them, you're just going to drag it along the bottom. Just slowly crawl on the bottom. Normally, when it's the warmer months, you're hopping it and dropping it and making all kinds of action. This time of year, just drag it. Those crawdads come out, they're kind of lethargic. They don't move very fast. So you have to mimic that. So simply dragging it on the bottom with long pauses in between really mimics a crawdad. Color-wise, the old black and blue works really well. Black and chartreuse. And shades of green and brown. Those are like the colors that I go with. I don't really go too crazy with a bunch of other different colors. That's about it. And a football jig is really all I fish during this time of year because I am dragging it on the bottom. One of the differences that I will do is riprap. If you get a stretch of warm weather, typically sunny weather, but even if it warms up and it's raining, that'll warm that water up. And the crawdads, they'll be on those rocks and they'll come out to feed, and the bass will come there to feed on the crawdads. So they will come up a little bit shallower. Typically in this time of year, you're fishing 20 to 30 to 40 foot deep. But when you get that warming trim, and if you've got some riprap, get up on there. You'll be in 10, 15 foot of water, maybe even shallower than that. But fish it with that jig and fish it in and around the way I just mentioned. However, one little trick I like to do is sometimes I like to bounce it really hard on the rock and let it pause. I'll especially do this with a tungsten jig head. Now, I just told you not to hop up and down, so why would I recommend that? Because here you're appealing to the natural curiosity of the bass. You make some noise, kind of a clicking sound, tuck, 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 tuck on the rock, and then let it sit. And then after that long pause, move it slow again. A lot of times when you tick, 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 tick on the rock, the bass will come to investigate. What is that sound? And look around, it's trying to figure out what it is. And then it sees this jig moving along and it, and grabs it and bites it. So it's not really the action of it bouncing up and down that causes the bass to strike it. It's that sound that come over, investigate, now they see your jig and they bop it. So try that little trick. One other thing I like to do when I'm fishing jigs is I don't use, when I'm using a plastic trailer, a lot of guys, there's a ton of plastic trailers out there that have those ridges and edges on the claws, which makes them, move a lot. They wiggle a lot and they're very active and that's great to use in warmer water when there's a lot of action going on. But in the wintertime, you don't want that. So I'm using a trailer. If you notice here, this trailer just doesn't have any kind of ridges or anything on it. It's just straight up flat. And that works really well this time of year because it doesn't have a whole lot of action to it. Just the craws just stick up and don't move a whole lot, which is what you want. One other quick thing I do is I add attractant. Here I just use some Mega Strike, but you can use whatever you want and just put a little bit of attractant on there. I shouldn't even call it attractant, but what it does is when a bass bites it, they get that little burst of flavor and they tend to hold on to it a little bit longer, giving you a chance to set the hook. That bite can be really subtle sometimes and difficult to detect. So you want to put all the odds in your favor. I don't think putting scent on a lure really attracts them and makes them bite. Some people believe that, but I just feel it makes them hold on to it a bit longer, giving you that advantage to setting the hook. Now, I don't know if you believe it or not, but actually crankbaits can be really good in the wintertime. Yeah, except, again, just like the jigs, you got to fish it a little bit differently. Typically in the summer and the warmer months, you're casting and cranking and casting and cranking and moving it pretty quick. Here, you're going to slow it down and fish deeper. Fish with those crankbaits that get down to 20 foot or even deeper, and you're going to fish them slower. Now, here's the thing. A lot of these crankbaits, they've got these giant bills, right? And they get down there nice and deep and they work fine. I think these kind of crankbaits are good when the bass have moved up shallow and they're, like when the weather warms up and they're fishing and they're going along riprap, for example, like the scenario I just mentioned. You can throw them up there, even though this goes down to 20 foot deep, but crank it real slow and kind of bounce it off the rocks. and it just kind of wobbles and bumbles along. And even if you get a crawdad pattern even better, it kind of resembles a crawdad bumbling along. And just kind of go nice and slow that way, even though it dives real deep. The problem when you're trying to dive even deeper, where they are designed to go 20 foot or more, is they've got this wide wobble to them. And although you can dig in the ground and kick up some silt and get some more tension that way, that's a lot of action. A tighter vibration crankbait works a little bit better during the colder months. And manufacturers are now coming out with deep diving crankbaits like this. They've got, you know, a narrow bill, a really long, look at that. But it's a narrow bill. And that helps with that wiggle action. It doesn't wiggle as much. It's a little bit of tighter action. It still gets down there really deep. You're finding more of those type of crankbaits in the market these days. That one's a Japanese bait that I just showed you. But there's more and more coming on the market these days that have a thin, narrow bill that gives that tight wiggle, that gets them down deep. So that's a really good way of reaching those fish that are really deep. Again, just fish it slow though. You gotta remind yourself to fish it slow, and you'd be surprised how many fish you can catch even in the middle of wintertime on a crankbait. And finally, arguably my favorite type of bait during this time of year is the finesse baits. These are the ones you throw on spinning gear, right? Fluorocarbon line, 6-pound test. Yeah, right? But that gives a real natural appearance. That real light line, fluorocarbon doesn't float up and interfere with the action of the bait. It makes it look very natural in the water. And you're using typically a split shot or drop shot rig. I actually use split shot more than I do drop shot, unless I'm targeting something very specific, like a point or a hump or a specific break line in 25, 40 feet of water. Drop shot is great for that pinpoint, working it over a rock pile, for example. You can work it real thoroughly with a drop shot. Otherwise, split shot is better when you're doing covering more water and searching for bass. Jig heads work really well too, for that matter. You can drag them along the bottom just like you did with a football jig, and you can drag these baits along the bottom in a similar fashion. I like to use grubs. That's like one of the mainstays. Little 3-inch grubs, your salt and pepper grub like this, or smoke. You know, smoke. Those two will work perfect. This is a smoke and pepper, or just straight up smoke and a salt and pepper like that and clear. It works really well. I mean, that's, just put it on a jig head or split shot or drop shot. I mean, they're very, very versatile lures. You can use those in and day out. Tubes work really well. This tube here, I think this color is like, it's called an Old Ugly, I believe. But you can see it's on a jig head. And, you know, if you can see right here, just on a jig head. And again, you can just drag this on the bottom. It resembles a crawdad. And just work it real slow on the very bottom. And with a little movement, no real hopping and popping, just kind of drag along and stop and drag along and stop, and catch a ton of fish, both largemouth and smallmouth on tubes during the wintertime. And finally, your finesse rigs, right? Your finesse worms, like this. Oh, buddy, yeah. This is that magic. Aaron's Magic. This is a robo worm. So it looks like it's hand poured, but it's really not. Works fantastic. This you can put on any aforementioned rigs. This one happens to be a 5-inch. You can do 4-inch and 3-inch. And it's a real subtle way of catching fish in all depths, but particularly deeper depths. And again, I'll put some scent on them too for the same exact reason I mentioned before. And it can be a slow day of fishing that way, but you know, sometimes the slower the better. When the bite's really off and it's really cold, maybe a front's come through, man, these finesse baits shine. That is when they are standouts. They're just little edibles. I mean, think about it. If you're really full and you don't really feel like eating, you're not gonna eat a big snack, or you know, a big meal. But if, you know, someone comes by with a plate of cookies, well, yeah, I'll have a cookie, you know, or maybe a potato chip or two. That's kind of what finesse baits do. They're little small little snacks that a bass that may not be really actively feeding, but a little snack comes by like that, like, oh yeah, I'll have that, right? So even when they're not very active or very aggressive in feeding, those finesse baits can shine during the winter time. So those are the different baits that I use during the winter time. I hope that helps. For more tips and tricks like this, visit bassresource.com.